Good afternoon or good morning. My name is Carolyn DeFord, and I am presenting to you today on missing and murdered Indigenous women, more than a hashtag. This isn't a trending topic. This is an issue that impacts all of our lives. Or in Indian country, it impacts the majority of our lives. There's a quote that there's not any Indian family or Native American, Alaska Native family that hasn't been touched by this issue. And more than a hashtag comes to mind for me or is significant to me because lately this has been a topic that has gotten a lot of mainstream attention, but the true meaning behind the issue and the topic and how this impacts our communities and at what depth is not trending, it's not glamorous, and it's not anything that should be taken lightly or not given the reverence that the topic deserves. My name is Carolyn DeFord. I am the Human Trafficking Project Coordinator and MMIP Advocate for the Puyallup Tribe of Indians Community Domestic Violence Advocacy Program. I am grateful to you all for tuning in today and being present to watch this presentation. I work for the Puyallup Tribe Domestic Violence Program. The mission of our program is to address violence and abuse impacting our communities and to work to create safe communities for all through victims advocacy for survivors. Our services are not limited to tribal members. They are available to the whole tribal community, which would be if your abuser were a tribal member or your children are tribal members, you are part of our tribal community and eligible for services within our program. And we strive to provide culturally relevant healing services as well as advocacy. I am Puyallup and Nisqually and Cowlitz. I am also mixed settler or mixed Caucasian descent. In my language, we would call that posted. So Puyallup, Nisqually, and Cowlitz with mixed posted descendancy. I work with our program to address a lot of the issues in our community that impact missing and murdered Indigenous women and missing and murdered Indigenous people, as well as human trafficking. These issues, along with my personal experience, being the daughter of a missing person, my mother has been missing for 20 years, have really inspired me to provide community, belonging, and unity to other families on this journey, as well as address some of the issues in what capacity I'm available or what capacity I'm able in prevention. So being a survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault and witnessing my mom experience that, I work hard to try and raise awareness to teen dating violence, stalking, domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking, which are some of these major intersections causing our people to be targeted and be in harm's way, becoming missing and murdered. In 2016, I created an organization called Missing and Murdered Native Americans. We're on Facebook and Instagram, and we help families raise awareness for their loved ones, provide compassionate support, a listening ear, and troubleshooting as far as what kind of steps are next and what we can do to help them raise awareness on their healing journey. This is a sensitive subject. My dog is going to start barking right now because it's a sensitive topic and he wants to go outside. This is a sensitive topic. This is an issue that has broken or nearly broken the spirit of so many of our community members. And I myself, it's not something to be taken lightly. And some of the intersections that are impacting missing and murdered Indigenous people, missing and murdered Indigenous women are really triggering topics. If at any time during the presentation you're triggered, I apologize. Please take care of yourself, take care of your spirit, take a moment to breathe and step away if you need to, if you want to ask questions or speak about it or share your story in any way. I am available. I want to start with acknowledging the ancestral land that we reside upon. I'm currently in Nisqually territory. in my ancestral homelands. I guess I'm very blessed for that. So wherever you're at, take a minute to just acknowledge the ancestral lands of the Indigenous people where you're from, and know that they were caretakers and survivors, and their bones are here and their beliefs are here. Their creation stories are where we're sitting. This work and the healing that is taking place across globally right now for Indigenous people is a spiritual journey, and it's spiritual work. And I just want to acknowledge the prayers of our ancestors that have brought this work together, and are driving us in this healing work and leading us forward. We have prophecies that tell these stories of how this is going to happen, and that we will be the leaders of this, that our women will step up and bring us together and heal our generation. So with this, I just want to acknowledge the prayers that brought us together today, and express the gratitude for our ancestors who came before us in their teachings of balance and equality, of mind, body, and spirit. It's those teachings that we humbly strive to embrace every day and to pass on to our future generations. May the spirit of peace and protection be with us and cover us in our walk of life and everything that we do, and empower us to nurture one another. I hope that through today's presentation, you're able to glean some bit of information that resonates with you. On any level, there's a lot of factors. It's a deep topic, and we could do hour-long presentations on any aspect of it, whether that's the historical trauma and the Indian policy, or human trafficking, or domestic violence, ICWA and the Removal Act, and upcoming legislation. But we're going to go through some of this. And if there's anything deeper that you would like to talk about, you can raise your hand in the questions, and we'll try to do our best to address that, or come out with a publish an email that will address your questions. The objectives for today will be to discuss human trafficking in Indian country. We won't go deep into human trafficking, because the whole series that the Human Collaborative is doing is based on human trafficking survivors services policy, and what is being done, and what can we do to provide responses to those things. But we're going to talk a little bit about some of the nuances that are a little bit different within our tribal communities and in Indian country. We'll investigate the historical impacts of Native American communities. We'll touch briefly on statistics and the factors contributing to the crisis, and our jurisdictional challenges. And I hope that at the end, you'll have a better understanding of some of the factors contributing to this crisis, and what we can do to combat it. So missing and murdered Indigenous women, these are our sisters, our mothers, our aunties, our daughters, our cousins, our grandmothers, our granddaughters. They have been cared for and loved and prayed over. They have been in our ceremonies. They are a piece of us. We carry their DNA, and they're gone, but they're not forgotten. They're very much a part of our everyday lives, and we remember them and do our best to honor them, and heal through that the best that we can. That's another aspect of this, the hashtag. They think sometimes we see some of these non-native organizations, especially I've seen it a lot through Facebook lately, where they're marketing MMIW swag and t-shirts and face masks, and not having an understanding of the serious issue behind it, and the enormity of the trauma that has led up to the issue, and that continues to be perpetuated by the issue. I would also like to take a moment just to acknowledge that today is Wear Red Day, in remembrance of Savannah Greywind. She was 8 months pregnant when she went missing. She was a Spirit Lake tribal member, and she was found wrapped in a garbage bag or in plastic in the Red River right outside of her community, and her unborn baby had been cut from her womb, and it was a really tragic and gruesome story. And her family continues to raise that baby now in the most beautiful way that they can, in honoring Savannah's memory. And so in honor of her story today, and some of the change that has driven, in particularly Savannah's Act, which has the potential to be a very, very beneficial piece of legislation for Indian country. So I'm wearing red for Savannah and all of our missing and murdered today, and I just want to take a second to acknowledge her. Yesterday was a memorial for one of our First Nations sisters, Amber Takaro, who was, she was found murdered, and they have yet to catch her killer, and her family is still fighting for justice for that and the botched investigation that took place and is like a secondary victimization when our loved ones are gone. So human trafficking in Indian country, we've talked about in the previous episodes of the series about human trafficking, but simply put, it is compelling someone to work or engage in a commercial sex act in exchange for something of value. The link between missing and murdered and Indigenous women is poverty and homelessness, high rates of domestic violence and sexual violence, trafficking victims identifying as intimate partners. So this is my boyfriend, and the relationship just is not what I bought into or what I signed up for, and not identifying as trafficking, but as DV. Runaway youth and our high rates of youth in foster care and ICWA, the historical trauma that has been prevalent within Indian country since the time of colonization, our jurisdictional issues, and the relocation of Native Americans through failed Indian policy and legislation that took place in the very beginning, the Relocation Act and the Dawes Act. For example, you know, broken homes and familial trafficking in Indian country. Statistically, there's over 36% of our survivors were first trafficked by a family member, but we speculate that it's much, much more than that in Indian country, because our families are so close-knit, and sometimes we're so isolated from urban areas that these generational issues, trafficking has happened generation upon generation within the community. And so it's not something that is talked about, that you keep your business within your family and you, everybody may know, but nobody really talks about it. There's a lot of nuances into the familial trafficking, but we know that it's very, very prevalent within our tribal communities. And I was talking to an elder a couple of weeks ago about familial trafficking, and she said, "Oh, sweetie, it's generational. It's generation after generation, and we don't know any better if it's been so normalized that this is the way things are, that it's just the way things are." High rates of mental illness and substance abuse, and these are all symptoms and effects of historical trauma. So human trafficking in Indian country and missing and murdered Indigenous women have the same intersections, the same things that are putting us in harm's way or causing our people to be targeted. They're all rooted in historical trauma. Historical trauma is entirely different than consciously holding on to the past. This is something that is in your DNA. When you experience trauma, it has effect on your DNA and your genetic line, and how we cope with stress and the effects that has upon us at the time is passed on generation to generation. It results in defense mechanisms that are evolutionary. The epigenetics of how trauma affects our bodies is prevalent in Native Americans, in our African American communities, and Jewish communities that survived Holocaust. Anybody who has this long-term generation after generation of trauma. So we have a little video here that kind of breaks it down and talks about some of the statistics and how that historical trauma is playing out in Indian country.
Almost mad all the time. Problems controlling my anger. Can't really think of just one time. I know most of my anger comes from pain. Someone once told me the reason I have so much anger is from my dad, and it comes from my grandpa, which comes from his mom. That the anger is pain from so long ago. She says Indians are so full of pain, causes them to drink it all away, but instead it causes more pain. I have anger from pain. I have many generations of built-up pain. I hope that I can learn to forgive and heal, so I no longer carry the pain of my ancestors. I will forgive. I will heal.
1.5% of the U.S. population is Native American. Historical events such as removal from homelands, sexual abuse, exposure to violence, boarding schools, massacres, forced relocation, homicide, suicide, and multiple victimization are ways in which trauma has affected Native communities. 40% of Native Americans live below the poverty line. 39% have some form of a disability. Native children have 2.5 times greater risk of experiencing a trauma, and 30% have some form of depression, while 10% have PTSD. The suicide rate is 3 times higher for Native Americans. Native American women are 2.5 times more likely to be raped or sexually assaulted than women in the U.S. in general. Native Americans are 2.2 times more likely to have diagnosed diabetes.
So really everything that is affecting Indian country, that affects our communities, whether we live on our reservations or not, has deep roots in historical trauma. Residential boarding schools and children being ripped away from their families, from the loss of land, being removed from our ancestral lands like the Trail of Tears and the Allotment Act, and just literally from the time of colonization, everything that has happened within Indian country has been traumatic and is carried through our DNA. And that's really fascinating if you study it a little bit more and want more information on it. There's a lot of good resources out there. So the symptoms of historical trauma, as it showed, are high rates of illness, so poor health, unemployment and poverty, mental health issues, including high rates of depression and PTSD. And there was a quote that Native American children experience PTSD at higher rates than veterans coming back from war, which is really heartbreaking. These are babies and they're experiencing PTSD at the rates of experiencing or surviving war. Addiction and addiction related death, and our broken families, domestic violence and foster care, this overwhelming sense of shame and guilt and hopelessness, and the stereotypes and stigma that have been placed upon Indian people and Native American Indigenous people from the very beginning, being stupid or dirty or drunken or savages or all of the, I can't think of all of them off the top of my head, but they're all horrible. There's a lot of those stereotypes that we're still working hard to overcome. And those causes all come from colonization and acculturation and internalized oppression. And sometimes we oppress ourselves and don't even know it because it has been going on for so long. And sadly, lateral oppression, where we're oppressing each other and holding each other back and feeding into that crabs in the bucket mentality. And then my next, our pain. This was a slide from a presentation that I did with Innovations HTC last year. And it just kind of talked about some of the effects of historical trauma, being suicide, 12 per 100,000 for the general population and 17 per 100,000 for Indigenous people. Sexual assault is over double in Indian communities what it is for non-Native populations. Stalking is almost double. Sex trafficking is 40%. 40% of our victims, Native American victims, have been 40% of the sex trafficking victims have been Native American, which is drastically it's unbelievably high. Like there's it's hard to compare that to the amount of our population. We're less than 6 to 2% of our population, and yet we carry such a large amount of the survivors of sex trafficking are Native. Murder, high rates of murder. It's homicide is the leading cause of death, or the third leading cause of death for Native American women ages 10 to 24, and the third leading cause of death for Native American men ages 10 to 34. The third leading cause of death above cancer. Homicide is the leading cause of death for pregnant women of all races. That's sad, that not complications of pregnancy, not illness, not car accidents, murder for pregnant women due to domestic violence. Foster care. So many of our youth had been taken away from the very beginning and raised in non-Native homes and lost that piece of identity that keeps them grounded and rooted in who they are, and what we go through our whole lives to try and strive to get that piece of ourselves back causes long-term loss of your spirit and where you belong and what your purpose is, and all of those things that we need to lead purposeful, healthy lives. And then killed by police. I can't think of the updated statistic off the top of my head, but I want to say we're in the top 5 of races killed by police. And in this day and age where we're really fighting to defund and de-escalate and eliminate excessive use of force within our police forces, it's important to note that this is affecting marginalized communities, and Native American communities are within that top 5. So the effect of missing and murdered Indigenous women: when a loved one goes missing, they're just gone. There's no goodbye, there's no answer, there's no clues. Often there's nothing makes sense about the experience, and it causes this sense of grief that has been coined ambiguous loss. Dr. Pauline Boss introduced the concept in 1999, and it's been studied pretty widely, but it's getting a little bit more noticed lately because it's attributed to not only when people are missing or murdered, but when we lose somebody to mental health issues or chemical dependency, they're physically present and psychologically absent. Where when somebody is missing, they're psychologically present because we never had that goodbye or that closure and we don't know what happened, but they're physically absent. So it's one of the most distressful and profound losses because you can't make sense of it. It's a circle, it keeps going, there's no closure. It's just always there, and we don't get to go through those rituals that family members generally get to experience when they lose a loved one. We know that they're gone, and we've had a ceremony and we've done a funeral and a memorial and we've honored their lives, and it gives us these milestones that we're able to try and make sense of and honor our loved ones with. And when they're missing, that's not there, and it carries with you. And I don't know how to put words to it right at this moment because I'm going through some things with a missing person on our reservation, and I'm feeling with that family, and I'm being, my empathy is strong right now. And so this topic is also really kind of at the surface of my emotions, and it's just really hard to make sense of things that don't make sense. And that's what this ambiguous loss is. It's a form of complicated grief, grieving without the closure, if that makes any sense. And how do you learn to live with that? How do you carry on with that, especially for families of long-term missing? Where do you go when you're still grieving for 20 years and there's no answers, no justice, no accountability, and no opportunity, for communities who are very cultural and rooted in ceremony, no opportunity to send them on their way and honor their spirit in that way. So understanding the issue and the facts behind missing and murdered, or the issue of missing, when somebody just disappears, you can't just vanish, and how they're even lost within our data once they go missing. Currently in Washington State, we have 112 missing Native American people. Those are just the ones that are identified as Native American and the ones that have been reported into NCIC. So 112 out of just Washington State. NamUs is a voluntary database. It's the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. They currently have 617 missing Native Americans across the United States that have been entered either by family, advocates, or law enforcement into their database. 617. If Washington State Patrol has 112 and we have 50 states and there's only 617 of them in NamUs, we're missing a huge opportunity to have accurate accountability for really how this is impacting our country and our tribal communities and our tribal nations, but also finding them and getting the resources to the families to be able to bring their loved ones home. So we talked about our state database. Every state has a clearinghouse or a database or some form of tracking system that tracks and monitors and accounts for their missing persons. Not all of them account for Native Americans. Some of our states don't even have a checkbox in their missing persons reports that indicate Native. Some of them it's just other or non-Hispanic. And so our information is really skewed, but within our country, the FBI and the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, every missing person is required to be entered into NCIC within a particular amount of time, and every state varies what their time frame is for that. Whether they get entered appropriately or not is a whole nother question. In 2018, we had 9,114 missing Native American, Alaska Indian individuals in NCIC. In 2019, that number is 10,447. Already in 2020, the amount of missing people reports that are being shared and made are, I'm curious to see how that's going to come out, but it's already devastating in how this is affecting our communities. And how with COVID increasing so many of our vulnerabilities in areas that we were already at the top of the vulnerability list, isolation and lack of services and lack of, when we're isolated, we don't know where our loved ones are already. Maybe we've been quarantining or following stay-at-home orders, and when we come back out again, we're unable to catch up with people, and it takes a while for those numbers to be accounted for. So now that some of these stay-at-home orders have been lifted, we're starting to see more and more missing persons reports as we don't know when somebody went missing, and things are adding up now, and the reports are finally being made. So this is some data that was compiled in 2018. It was the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Report by the Urban Indian Health Institute. It was co-authored by Anita Lucchese from Sovereign Bodies Institute, and it compiled, it did public records requests and shared information from obituaries and public notices and newspaper articles and social media to compile data in a database that Sovereign Bodies Institute houses and takes care of, and continues to track data on our missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit. It took that data and analyzed it and found the statistics that we see here. The top 10 states with the highest number of MMIWG cases at the time, and this was 2018, were New Mexico and Washington, where I'm located, Arizona, Alaska, Montana, California, Nebraska, Utah, Minnesota, and Oklahoma. These are all states with high level, high numbers of tribal populations and reservations, and some of them border states, California and Arizona, New Mexico, Montana, Washington, we're all on international borders, and how that plays into our folks being trafficked across borders, and where our jurisdictional challenges come into place again in those areas. So the top 10 cities, and some of these cities were relocation cities from the Relocation Act between the 50s and the 80s, where Native Americans were paid and given maybe a stipend to leave their reservation and move to the city to find jobs. The services weren't always in place for them once they got into that city. There weren't cultural support systems in place for them once they got into these relocation cities. But a lot of the cities that we see on this list were relocation cities. And this doesn't even show, Minnesota and Minneapolis on here, but and Rapid City, and they have been hit very hard by this as well. It's just the lack of the data being accessible or being accurately collected and shared within platforms that are able to analyze and look at how we can effectively impact this issue. So the impact of historical trauma is causing high rates of domestic violence and sexual assault. And so one of the things that I mentioned briefly a little bit ago was that homicide is the third leading cause of death for Native American women ages 10 to 24 and Native American boys and men ages 10 to 34. It's responsible for nearly 75% of Native homicides, and that was a report that was published a few years ago by the CDC. And then the prevalence of human trafficking survivors identifying as domestic violence survivors, and many not even reporting. There's so much stigma about reporting your experiences or seeking help or having access to help that these numbers are likely much, much higher. But when you look at the prevalence of violence in Indian country, this quote in this photo really rings true, that many of us have been abused, as were our mothers. We grew up watching our mothers be abused and seeing violence on a regular basis within our homes and our communities, and it's been normalized. By the time a Native woman has picked up the phone to call 911 or to call for help, the level of violence and how long she's been experiencing it have already reached lethal levels. It's so normal that by the time it's really scary and we're really scared, we might pick up the phone. And how our law enforcement and our first responders are interacting with tribal communities, with Native American women when they're reporting or calling for help in urban areas, really needs to be addressed. They need to have trauma-informed care and know, some cultural sensitivity training to know that how this has impacted Native populations for generation after generation after generation already brings that phone call to a certain level of danger that needs to be taken into consideration in our responses. Not just de-escalating it at the moment and leaving with the abuser still there to continue to do harm. So when we look at our children and our runaway youth, in the NCIC report that said we have 10,447, we also have 7,858 of them are under the age of 18. That's terrifying if you're a parent, or a grandmother or an auntie. And we know that when our youth are running away or they're in foster care, that they're so much more vulnerable to being in harm's way or being the victim of violence or any of the other negative things that can happen to them, assaults and chemical dependency and higher rates of mental health issues and poverty due to their experiences and the trauma that they faced, and educational limitations and lack of resources. There's only a few states within the country that even have runaway laws to decriminalize the runaway and provide services for them. In most states, it's not a crime to run away from home, but we need to have laws in place and look at how laws are written in our cities and our communities and on our reservations that are addressing and providing services for our runaway youth. Runaway and homeless youth are at high risk for physical assault, sexual exploitation, mental health disabilities, substance abuse, and death. It's estimated that 5,000 unaccompanied youth die each year as the result of assault, illness, or suicide. How many of them are homeless and on the streets and unidentified? How many of them are never found? We don't know, because nobody's really collecting that data, and they may not even know that they're Native American when they're recovered or found or engaging in services for their wellness. This is a young girl who went missing in 2018. Her story breaks my heart because it was 100% preventable. Her name was Henny Scott. She went missing right before Christmas, December 2018. It's cold outside and there's a lot of snow in Montana where she's from. She was from Lame Deer, Montana, and she could have been, she was kind of going back and forth between the Crow Reservation and Cheyenne Reservation. Her family tried to make a missing persons report and were told she would come back home. Nobody really took them seriously. After a week or so, the family was getting some support through advocates in the community and were able to get a missing persons report made. But they really had to fight for that report. They had to demand that somebody take this missing persons report. Lame Deer wouldn't take it. Lame Deer police wouldn't take it. The BIA wouldn't take it. Crow Reservation wouldn't take it because she lived in one area and went missing in another area. And these jurisdictional challenges, like this family's story, is a prime example of how much time is wasted while our jurisdictional authorities and entities play who's on first, trying to figure out whose job it is to take this missing persons report. Somebody finally took her report and they put it on the desk of a detective who was out on vacation. When he came back 2 weeks later, she had been missing for 2 weeks already. The family was tracking her down the best that they could, and anytime they'd get word as to where she was at, she was already gone. They heard a rumor or story that she had gotten into a fight at a party and left with some unknown young men. A couple days later, they were able to coordinate a search on their own, a community coordinated search, not a law enforcement coordinated search. No assistance really from law enforcement in that area at all. And they found her a short distance from where she was last seen, and she had visible signs of an assault, and the cause of death was deemed hypothermia. And before they could even get the medical examiner and detectives and people out to the site where they recovered her body, it was getting dark and they had to wait until the next day. So her family held vigil out in the outdoors, in the elements, right after Christmas, with her body, and unable to bring it back and prepare it and pray over it and have ceremony for her the way that their customs would have allowed or would have guided them. This was preventable, and the family fought and cried for help the whole time, and nobody would listen to them and just kind of written it off as a runaway youth, and she's fine and she's out partying and she'll come back when she wants to. And when we're seeing these reports of runaway youth in our communities and missing youth, and we need to know that it's not just a missing persons report or a runaway, that these are missing endangered simply for the fact that they're marginalized, that they're marginalized community, that they're Native American, that they are subject to this jurisdictional nonsense of who's going to find them and when, and that they're youth, they're children, they're vulnerable and impressionable and targeted. And how are we supporting those families, and what can we do to share those posters and report where they're at if we hear or see anything about where they're at, to help get them home and to help get them services if they need services. But don't ignore them just because they're runaway. And I think a lot of people don't share those runaway reports, don't share those runaway youth, because we're a little desensitized to it, maybe, until it's your child. That story is really hard for me to tell sometimes, because she could be any of our babies, and she had so much life and potential, and she's one of over 5,000 girls, women and girls that have gone missing, and just one. The next story, her name is Kelsey Collins. She was a young girl whose family was from Minnesota, and I can't recall off the top of my head what tribe she was, but they relocated over here, and she had gone through some trauma in her family, causing this relocation over to the Seattle, Everett, Washington area. She was a good girl, and was creative and fun and a light-spirited teenager, and she met this young man who was attractive and had all this swag, and she thought she was in love, and it was a wonderful romance. It took off really quickly, and he was trying to get her to strip, and she said no way. And eventually he broke her down, and she did, and he trafficked her up and down the I-5 corridor from the Seattle area down to Portland, Oregon, and back. And he would have her back for school on Monday and then back out again. And he ended up selling her to a very violent pimp in the Portland area, and she was missing for quite a while. She encountered and had an intervention with law enforcement, and they were able to rescue her from this experience, and she agreed to provide testimony in prosecuting this really violent pimp. And during the court proceedings and how strewn out they are, she was home with her family, and she was getting her life back in order, and she had a new boyfriend that she was really in love with, who was a good guy. And she told her mom she was going to go see her boyfriend in Seattle, and they had just gotten ready to color Easter eggs. They'd just gotten ready to color Easter eggs and have their family Easter. And she didn't come back. She went into Seattle to see her boyfriend and didn't come back. And her phone pinged in the Capitol Hill area several times before it went dead. And there's a lot of theory that, that she was taken out by her pimp and his associates, because she was about to give testimony that would have brought down a pretty large network. And she was just a baby when all this happened. She was only 16 when it all started and 18 when she went missing. So the data challenge, the accurate reporting of our race, some of it being optional. NamUs is optional. Indian country case statistics are taken from 3 different jurisdictions: our federal, which is the NCIC, state, which is our state clearinghouses, and they should all be in NCIC as well, and then tribal. Some of our tribes don't have policies, procedures, and protocols for responding to missing person cases. Some of them don't have access to NCIC to get their cases put into our federal databases. And in order to get access to those, to get the TAP tribal, is it called the tribal access something portal? I can't remember. It's TAP. There's an acronym for that. But in order to get TAP, they have to meet certain requirements, and they're not always in line with protecting our sovereignty. So the FBI's Unified Crime Report contains criminal offense data from all three of those sources. But the problem with the UCR report, the Unified Crime Data Report, is that it is voluntary through different through states and local jurisdictions. And the states can make their own criteria for what they report and how far back they go. So none of it is really cohesive and doesn't mesh up with one another. And so the data is just, it's just numbers. You know, it's not, none of it is consistent. And we need to fix that, but there's so many gaps in how these systems communicate with one another and how we define missing and how we define whether we even account for Native American in the state that we're in or in the community that we're in. I can't tell you how many times I've been with a program or in a conference or watching a presentation and asked an organization how they track their Native Americans or what kind of data they have on Native Americans, and they don't track it, they don't collect it. And this is one of the challenges that we face, is that we're the only ones collecting our data, but 70% of our population are residing in urban areas that aren't counting us. Many agencies across the nation aren't required to record Native American as race, and others misclassify it as other or being East Indian rather than Native American Indian, or just Caucasian and white. They're just lazy and they don't record the race for many. So that's been a really big challenge, is trying to make sure that those races are accurately recorded and counted. I want to go back to the data piece here for a second. I was filtering around through a website called Justice for Native Women, and it's been around for quite a while. This is a really great website for looking at your area, your city and state, and seeing the pictures and the stories behind the women and girls in Two-Spirit who've gone missing. They also have a link in there that is some of their data, and I shared that with our Washington State Patrol last week. Because there were a lot of names in there that weren't on our state database, and they weren't in NamUs. And we average 112, and she was able to identify potentially 30 cases out of that one advocate's work that were still missing, and the NCIC report was incorrectly, or they're still investigating, but that the NCIC report wasn't, maybe it wasn't validated, you know, maybe the race wasn't recorded accurately in the NCIC report. There's a lot of different things that they're still investigating to find out why they don't have that information. Some of them may have been found, so they're filtering through that, but it's just another example of how important data is in getting this information, and some of the gaps that we face in knowing exactly how this is impacting our communities. And then NCIC and NamUs. I was going through NamUs the other day and looking at the names within that in my community and through NCIC in my community. And there are cases in NamUs that are Native American that aren't listed Native American with our states. So if you or a loved one, or you're working with a family member who has someone who's missing, help make sure that every system that they're in, that it says Native American. If you're attending conferences or trainings or working in organizations, advocate and push that they're tracking that Native American data, because when it comes to getting the appropriate services and culturally sensitive support systems in place for our Native people in all of our prevention work, it has to be made for us, you know, built for dealing with the cultural nuances of Native American communities. Um, so the next one, even without comprehensive database, accurately recording missing and murdered Native American women, the number of cases reported in the United States is shocking. You know, like I said, the 30 that are just in that advocates website that are not in our state. And that's just my state. So times that by 50, or potentially how many are out there. And in order to address this issue, we have to address the whole issue from the ground up. We have to get upstream and do the upstream approach, the primary prevention, and make sure that our children are growing up in communities that are safe and that they're learning healthy relationships and communication and coping strategies, and they're getting the supports that they need to heal the trauma that they carry, that is in their DNA, that is not their own faults. There's a quote that, you know, when you heal yourself, you heal 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. And that's true. When we get therapy for our traumas, it fixes those pieces of our DNA, rewires our brain. And when we heal and we have children, we pass that healed DNA onto our children. And as a grandmother and potential, hopefully having more grandkids, I keep bugging my daughter, please go get therapy. Let's figure out how to heal ourselves and heal each other, so that, you know, our grandchildren and your babies aren't dealing with some of the stuff that we deal with, like anxiety and depression and just the effects of trauma that we don't even realize are affecting us. And then to address the issue, we have to address the whole issue, not just women. In most cases, in our state, in Washington State, and in NamUs, over 50 to 60% of our missing persons reports are men. Our men are going missing and murdered too. And if we're going to fix this issue, we have to fix the whole issue. We can't just fix a portion of it. These men that are going missing are our providers. And when they're gone, who's feeding the family? Who's watching out for the kids? Who's being the protector? You know, and what kind of message does that send about your worth to our young men when we're not searching for their fathers and their uncles, their teachers in our communities, and we need them. And the sad thing is, you know, the majority of the perpetrators of violence against women and violence against men are men. So we need healing services in place. We need to be looking at how do we break down that misogynistic, toxic masculinity, all these things that, you know, the stigma of receiving help and getting help and being vulnerable for our men, and build them back up so that we can heal our communities and break this cycle. If we can heal that, we can reduce the rates of domestic violence and sexual assault, child abuse and neglect, and homicide and human trafficking, and all of these things that we're trying to deal with. All of these ugly things, you know. Public health, you know, this is a public health issue, but it also requires community solutions. These are problems that are deeply ingrained within our families, our communities, and our systems. We need policy changes, and we need people to be a voice, and the power of sharing your story, and whether that's the healing power of sharing your story, or the power to drive policy by sharing your story and your truth. There's nothing more moving in driving change than hearing firsthand from somebody with those experiences. So it took me nearly 18 years to talk about my mom. You know, my mom has been missing since 1999, and took me a long time to talk about her openly. And when I did, it was because I didn't want any other families to have to go through this. And I wanted to be able to, if her story could help drive change, then I wanted to be able to share that experience and how that had affected me. Sorry if you hear my dog scratching over there. She's got allergies. she's noisy and gross. She's sweet. We need to be pushing for the services that we need in our communities. And this doesn't necessarily mean that we're calling on our cities and states and tribal councils to provide these services. If you see it needs done, do it. One of my aunties said that one day when I said, "What can I do to help?" And she said, "If you see it needs done, do it." And I think about that a lot, about what we have happening and needing within our communities for healing and for wellness and for awareness. If you know that there's an area that needs services and maybe a venue or a platform to provide it, let's do it. It needs to be done. And those are those organic things are the most powerful, but our communities need access to healing services and support services to maintain and provide stability and self-sufficiency. We need harm reduction training and systems in place, and they need to be focused specifically on the targeted clients or audience. Stable housing across the board for everybody. There's so many gaps in stable housing that statistically we know the rates of child abuse and neglect and runaway and these things are reduced when you have a safe place to lay your head at night. And then these training sessions and being able to provide awareness and education training for preventative measures and red flags and all of the intersections that impact missing and murdered Indigenous people. Child abuse and neglect training and parenting classes and domestic violence intervention and bystander intervention and communication and healthy relationships and human trafficking awareness and resource trainings and responding and knowing how to recognize those red flags and the upstream approaches and the primary prevention. There's a story about the 3 Indian sisters in the river, and I'm going to butcher it. I'm not a great storyteller, but this really, it really hits home as far as the primary prevention piece. But the story is old, and our ancestors knew these things, and they shared these teachings in story. But the 3 sisters in the river, and the babies are floating down the river, and the sisters are catching the babies, and they keep coming, and one of the sisters stops and walks away, and the other 2 ask her, "Where are you going?" And she's going to go find out why the babies are, she's going to go to the root of the problem and find out why the babies are being thrown into the river. And then relationships, leverage your relationships, build relationships with one another, because they're so preventative, and they're also powerful in sharing wellness and healing and culture and driving change and getting the job done. And then community solutions, strengthening our communities and culture and healing as a protective factor. We know how protective and preventive culture is. We need mentor programs where we're empowering our healed adults to heal and mentor our vulnerable youth and our vulnerable populations. And then youth programs and acceptance to break down the stigma behind some of the things that are affecting our communities. So breaking those cycles of structural violence in our communities and advocating for policy change, being aware of where the policy changes need to happen, and using your platform and your voice. No matter what it is we do, we have an intersection and an opportunity to break these cycles and communicate with our tribal leaders and the FBI and community members and let them know what we need and what we see. Create community awareness and education opportunities, one for self-sufficiency and also wellness and prevention. And then, for family members of our missing and murdered loved ones, supporting them and building their resilience and acknowledging acknowledging these intersections, but when there are, let's see, when we participate in events for our loved ones, those are our ceremony. We don't get the funerals, and we don't get celebration of life. We might get candlelight vigils, and when our loved one first goes missing, if we have a good strong support system, there's searches and rallies and poster distribution. Those are ceremony. Those are our ceremony. On some communities wear red every Thursday, and that is ceremony. When I wear red, that's my ceremony. That's the time that I put that on intentionally to acknowledge all of our missing and murdered. I think about my mom when I stand with my poster and I share my flag and I tell my mom's story. That's ceremony. Being able to lean on your community when these things knock the wind out of you, and having that support system with our elders and with other MMIW families, that builds our resilience. Practicing our culture is so healing, and it releases trauma, and it reminds us that we're a part of this bigger, beautiful tapestry of Indigenous people, and it helps us see where we fit and have purpose in that, and the peer supports that come through all of those things build the resilience and the ability to keep going and heal in a good way. What you can do, and we've kind of already covered this, so I don't want to go over it too much, but it's just do what you can where you can. Everybody's lens at looking at an issue picks out or gleans a different experience from the issue in some way. And so if you see an opportunity where you can use your talent, your voice, your work, your community connections to raise awareness or drive change, to facilitate or host trainings on any of these intersections, on preventing human trafficking, recognizing red flags, on bystander intervention for domestic violence, on how to support runaway youth, any of that, chemical dependency and mental health supports, anything that you can do to bring this awareness to your community and help build our system of warriors working in this issue, we need you to do. We need you, and there's a place for everybody. Call out violence, call it out. I can't say how many times I see the sexualization of women and sexualization of Native women in memes and jokes online, and those things perpetuate violence. They perpetuate rape culture, and the idea that people are items to be obtained or possessions, and they're not. And so call those things out. If you have a friend who is struggling or needs help, reach out to them, and call out unhealthy behaviors in a good way. Say, I see you and I support you. How can I help you? Engage our youth, because that's where we're going to break the cycle, is getting upstream and teaching our youth about what kind of things are out there that are good, about culture and about advocacy and about having a voice and activism and making a difference and knowing who they are and where they come from. Engage our youth in our community projects. And social media is a huge platform for raising awareness to all of these issues and helping us find our missing people, and running campaigns to share petitions or get like-minded people on the same page to do the good work in one avenue. Anything that you can do, we need you to do it. And any ideas that you have to do those things, share them, because we're always looking for innovative, new approaches to do the work that we're doing. Everywhere, this quote, I kind of hits home. Everywhere our people are grieving for their loved ones who are lost or have been taken too soon. We remember and honor them and hold them close. We uplift one another so that we have the strength to proceed down the paths which we're called. For families of missing, that is so hard. And everybody experiences trauma and copes with trauma differently. So within one family unit, we may be seeing everybody experience or express their trauma and their stress differently, fight, flight, or freeze, and those of us who are fighting don't understand why those ones are freezing. Lift one another up and just walk in love and be compassionate, and support each other through these hard times when someone's gone and while we're searching and after they've been brought home. Especially, how are we supporting family members who have been missing for periods of time and experienced unspeakable traumas, and what support are we giving them when they come home? Are we breaking down the stigma for them to come home and have a safe space to be? Just lift one another up in those good ways. And then I'm so grateful that we are able to come together to honor our missing and murdered relatives, to find healing and sharing these stories, and always for the pursuit of justice, because our loved ones are gone but never forgotten. And these are just my closers, and I think this was going to play through, but it doesn't have to be this way. It's preventable. And some resources if you want some more resources about some of the prevention and some of the data that is out there. And I don't have Sovereign Bodies Institute on here, but Sovereign Bodies Institute provides healing groups. They provide talking circles, and they're doing great work in the area of research and survivor advocacy and empowering survivor voices. And we've got, I don't have Innovations HTC on here either. I need to update this slide. Also, with the work that we're doing in relation to human trafficking in Indian country, Innovations HTC is providing culturally relevant services to tribal communities to create protocols for response, to drive awareness, to help incorporate policies and procedures, and training of all of our tribal entities in their intersections. So there's a lot of great resources available out there if you need them, and we'll be able to share them with you if you like. I have time for 2 questions. Okay, so I live in the Milton adjacent to Puyallup tribal lands. As a local resident, one person, what can I do? I want to help any way I can. You can join some of the social media groups and share those posters. Attend our events. We're currently searching for a missing person in the Puyallup area, and we need all the boots on the ground that we can get to get the word out for those folks. Raise awareness about domestic violence and call it out. Educate yourself about how these issues are impacting your community and what resources are available directly in your community. If somebody needs help, then you can provide those. And then we're always there's a lack of resources that require funding, both through some of our nonprofits and just families, even in help in raising money for searches and for rewards, fundraisers, and sharing the information for those fundraisers. Was there another question? What do you want the Seattle City Council to know about decriminalizing buyers, traffickers, giving them protections? How do you feel that will impact Native communities? I think that's going to be devastating. I think that they need to keep in mind the most vulnerable populations. Those that are lured or in tribal communities, our youth are most vulnerable, who are not willfully engaged in sex work, but have been lured or are in this through force, fraud, or coercion don't get the luxury of filling out a background check or choosing who they go on dates with. And we need to have those protections in place for our most vulnerable. The less we normalize it, the more vulnerable our people are going to be. And do we really want Washington and the South Puget Sound to be a tourist destination for sex buyers? I mean, I don't, and I don't want to worry about going to Seattle and having my family be in danger due to all of the negative impacts that could bring. They need to be taking survivor voices into consideration when they're making, our Seattle City Council, Tacoma City Council, our states need to be taking survivor voices into consideration when they're making those decisions. And I don't know that I trust that they're truly hearing that. Any other questions? Okay. I just want to say thank you for watching my presentation. I apologize for my technical errors. I'm going to have to learn how to share a little bit better in my Zoom platform, and especially share my PowerPoint screen. This is all new for me, and I appreciate your patience, and I appreciate your passion to learn and hear about missing and murdered, and how some of the challenges that we face, the intersections, and what we can do to help drive change. There's a lot being done on local and national levels as far as legislation that we need a lot of support. We need people writing letters and sharing information with our legislators about what needs to be done and how we feel about the decisions that they're making. So thank you all. I appreciate your time, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share today.